Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. So for the past 2 weeks, understandably, all of the focus has been on Donald Trump and that seismic election result, and we are going to be talking a lot about that in weeks to come. But there's another story that has been happening closer to home here in the UK, and that is Germany. Because in case you haven't noticed, they are facing something approaching an economic crisis. Their government is falling apart. They have general elections scheduled for February. But Europe, at the heart of Europe, Germany is looking like it's got its own big problems, and it could have enormously profound consequences for the continent of Europe, for the UK, and even for the US. Well, happily, there is someone who understands it better than anyone else. His name is Wolfgang Münchau. He has been on the show before, and he has a new book, Kaputt, coming out, which tells the story of how Germany found itself in this unenviable position. He's here in the studio. Welcome, Wolfgang.
Hello, Freddie.
So we have so much that we could cover today. I think for our audience, the most useful place to start might be, give us your version of the history of how, in recent decades, Germany found itself at this moment of crisis. Because it feels like the whole model for that country, the whole way that it was successful, and the reason it's been thought of as this incredibly strong cornerstone of European power, now suddenly looks like it's not working anymore. How should we understand that story?
The best way to understand the story is to understand it as a long history, because it only sort of people took note of it in the last year or so. In fact, some people only took note of it in the last month or so. The decline of the German economy became visible in the statistics at around 2017, 2018. Now, interestingly, this is shortly after the British referendum, and this was indeed a factor. Not the main cause of it, but it was one of the triggers of the industrial decline. I would say the main origins date back to the days of Gerhard Schröder, when he was Chancellor in the early 2000s, and the long reign of Angela Merkel. And what happened to Germany was that the country had, ever since the Second World War, specialized on industry. And this was a very successful strategy, and I do not criticize the fact that they did this. And they built a model very much based on a modern industrial economy with great specialization in cars, mechanical engineering, chemistry. And they were world leaders in many of these sub-segments of these areas.
Yeah, we were all jealous of it.
Absolutely.
It was talked about in every newspaper column for 25 years. The German industrial model, why can't we have that?
That's right. That was the envy of the world. And the whole country was geared towards this. It's not just the industry. You had research institutes, both sort of theoretical and practical, that linked between universities, corporates, and sort of pure science.
And government? So they were government funded?
Governments played a role through funding, through special banks. There's a special government-owned bank that funded a lot of this research.
So for an example of that would be what? Near Stuttgart, where the Mercedes factories are, there would be research institutes looking at,
yes,
engine design or something.
It wasn't in Stuttgart, it was in Aachen, which is a different place. But ultimately, that's exactly what happened. There was an institute for the development of diesel engines. These were highly specialist institutes that would be funded by industry, but it worked together. But what Germany was never good at, or at least not good at since the 1980s, was the idea of moving outside of this network. Germany was quite good at this. In my book, I write the story of Aldi, the supermarket chain that's now so present in the UK.
Because you actually come from the town.
Yeah, it comes from the town where I grew up.
Aldi founder.
Absolutely,
lived.
and this,
what's he called? Well, Aldi is short for
Albrecht. It was Albrecht Discount. And one of the brothers, there were two brothers, Karl Albrecht, who lived in the town where I lived, he became Germany's richest man, and he was secretive. We didn't know where he lived. He was a ghost in our city. Everyone tried to figure out where they lived, but not with no success. I hasten to add. And by the time he died, in his he was, I think, very old, about 10 years ago, he had never met a German chancellor. So this was an entrepreneur, old-fashioned. He didn't need politics for this. This was classic. He kind of had an idea, or he and his brother had an idea. inherited basically a supermarket, not a supermarket. They inherited a corner store from their family, and then they developed this into, probably
Huge
one of the world's largest
warehouse,
retail chain with a whole new idea. This was a whole sort of business idea that just caught on and made a lot of money for this family. This was an entrepreneurial area, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then it flipped. It became very much focused on industry, very much focused on picking, not so much that the government was picking winners, the government supported the system. And it did well. There was engineering, the system kept on giving. It was essentially the invention of the motor car in the 19th century. They were still making a lot of money until very few years ago, and that has then changed when there was a technological change. And I think this is probably the single most important thing that happened. They underestimated. It was a consensus system, so everybody kind of agreed with something, and they underestimated the digital world. They underestimated the electric car. The chairman of VW, one of the patriarchs, he was part of the Porsche family, and they are linked to VW. He used to say, there is no space for electric cars in my garage. There was an arrogance about anything that was like not what they invented. And they didn't invest. Whereas China did, Tesla did, they didn't invest. And they're still struggling with software, which is where the future money will come from. They're struggling with batteries. They're struggling with small cars. And they have now realized that they have a crisis. They want to close down factories, the first time ever. And this is kind of symptomatic of what's happening in the economy. A hugely successful company that's basically misread the world and is now suddenly realizing, oh my God, the Chinese are not only cheaper, and that's what they always thought, the Chinese are cheap, but they're actually better. And that's something they hadn't been able to...
So that, I suppose, is reason one and the most impactful, which is that the whole German economy and even country is geared towards a certain type of industry based around chemicals, the engine, which is no longer powering the biggest companies in the world. So it's losing out, and it has failed to adapt. It's failed to rethink things. You talk a lot in the book also about energy. Tell us what went wrong with German energy.
Now, the energy history is a really sad one. Germany was a leading country in nuclear research. It had more nuclear chemists and nuclear physicists than many other countries. I think today there are only about 3 or 4 nuclear chemists left in the entire university sector. The nuclear industry gave rise to a protest movement in the 1970s, as it did in many other countries. It was the 60s protest movement that a large portion of it, merged into this sort of the environmental group, which later became the Green Party, and it was their sort of historic mission to get rid of nuclear power. And then eventually the Greens became part of coalition governments. In the early 2000s, they got the government to agree a total phase out of nuclear power, but not until 2030. So we would still have it under that agreement. And then it was Angela Merkel who, after the Fukushima incident in Japan, unilaterally decided to bring this date forward. And at the time when the last 6 power stations, that were still accounting for 15% of the energy supply. So it's almost as much as in percentage terms as the United States, where it's 20%. So Germany was still nuclear powered 3 years ago when this coalition, the current coalition, came to power. But because of the agreements they had in the coalition, because of the political essentially gridlock, because you couldn't just change what they planned to do, they switched these power stations off according to schedule. This was not, they were scheduled to move. That was the Merkel schedule. She had brought it forward. It was the dates.
But this, I've just got to stop and emphasize this, because this must now rank among one of the kind of biggest acts of self-harm that a modern economy has done. The German economy, the government decided to completely remove their very strong nuclear sector, strongest possibly in the world at some point, and instead become 100% reliant on imported gas from basically Russia, which, as we've seen in the last few years, was a very vulnerable place to put themselves. So that single decision, which I guess Angela Merkel is partly responsible for, but previous chancellors as well, that must be responsible for a big chunk of the current crisis. Because if they had a thriving alternative power source, that would be feeding the industrial base. It would be helping ease this problem.
It would also help them develop an industry they wanted to get in but failed, which is artificial intelligence, because that requires a lot of cheap power. The idea that Merkel had and the generation in the last, the political generation of the last decade, was that the country would make a very strong transition to renewable energies, and the gas would be the backdrop, the backstop to this transition, to deal with intermittency problems. So you would have a strong supply of gas-fired power stations and your renewables, and those two sources would be the main idea. What happened, obviously, that was highly dependent on the Russia gas pipelines producing or supplying abundant cheap gas forever. That illusion in Germany ended only when Putin invaded Ukraine. It had ended elsewhere in Europe much earlier. I remember writing about this in 2015, around the time 2014, when Putin invaded Crimea. It was already clear that this became not sustainable, and people raised the issue with Germany at the time. But Germany was resistant. It resisted this in an extreme way. It was a national interest matter, no matter what the US said, no matter what France said, no matter what Poland said.
And one of the characters, it must be said, who was warning about this way back then was Donald Trump. At least there are videos that are very popular among his supporters of him addressing this head on, and the kind of German delegation, I think it might even have been the UN, sort of pretty much sniggering and thinking, who is this?
Indeed,
brute?
And that's sort of hard for many people to swallow that on this issue Trump was right and the German consensus was wrong. But the sniggering German diplomats were pretty much very reflective of a national consensus, and everybody agreed with this.
So
policy.
what did they think would happen? What was this amazing new energy source that was supposed to be flourishing by now?
The idea was that gas was relatively cheap. They thought the supply was secure, and they thought that most of the energy would over a longer period of time shift to renewables, which would be even cheaper and even more secure. So the idea was this sort of duality.
But that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened. Well, the renewables are up at 50% of the total supply, so that part went according to plan. The problem is that Germany needs a strong backup, and gas is an expensive backup because Germany now buys the gas on world markets.
Am I right that a big part of the political unrest comes down to that decision and the sense that sort of idealistic left-leaning progressives with ideas of reducing carbon footprints and all the rest of it have landed Germany in this pickle, and that it's actually self-destructive?
I would not sort of classify it sort of simply in terms of left and right. There's certainly what you said. There was this idea, but parts of the left are not green. For example, Scholz is not particularly green. Scholz is more wedded to the industrial sector. So you have a coalition of people who want, if you listen to the Greens, they also want industrial policies. They want green industry. They want green power. But they're all wedded to the industrial model. I think the real difference in German politics is between those, and that's still a majority, who are clinging on to the industrial models, and there's a left-wing component and a right-wing component. And those who basically said you got to get out of these sort of dependencies and hedge your bets a little bit and allow other sectors to develop. There's a huge unhappiness in Germany in the sort of startup company scene, because all the bureaucracy that has been created, the costs. It's been really difficult for startup companies in Germany today compared to 20 or 30 years ago. This has become a very hostile territory. And the way this government and others increase minimum wages, how they increase pension contributions, the massive bureaucracy that was created in Germany, but also in the EU, very much at Germany's behest, has now basically turned Germany and the EU into a very hostile environment for entrepreneurs.
So we've got the failure to innovate or move on from a particular type of industry. We've got terrible decisions around energy. And I guess a third one must be the retreat of globalization, because the good years when Germany was booming, were really dependent on a kind of happy globalized trading environment with China buying their cars and energy coming from Russia and everything kind of hunky-dory. As soon as that has shifted, Germany finds itself pretty vulnerable.
Absolutely. There's a bit more to that story. German industry had a similar kind of crisis in the early 2000s. And there were a number of things that saved it. And globalization was one of them. It was especially the globalization of supply chains. Just-in-time supply chain management gave huge productivity gains to them. Another fillip were, of course, sort of competitiveness reforms. The government managed to suppress wages in that time was positive for companies. Perhaps the biggest thing that prolonged the industrial delusion of success was the euro crisis, which led to a devaluation of the euro without generating inflation. So Germany got itself a 10-20% trade advantage because its neighboring countries managed to get themselves into a crisis. They had a fixed exchange rate within the eurozone. So
we had Yanis Varoufakis here earlier in the week, and he was Greek finance minister at that time. A lot of those countries are very unhappy about that advantage Germany
and he
enjoyed.
Is now, I'm sure he must be, he will probably feel vindicated in a lot of things he said at the time about the German model, which was, I always agreed with him on that point, an unsustainable model that had to end. It was always based on, also that if you look at the macroeconomics behind it, it generated huge surpluses. Now, it's fine for a small economy like Ireland or Iceland to create huge surpluses. The rest of the world is pretty much the entire world. But if you are the world's third largest economy in dollar terms, which Germany is now, then if you run huge surpluses, it affects the rest of the world. It affects Europe. It affects everybody, and there needs to be somebody to absorb those surpluses.
Someone has to have a deficit.
Somebody has to have a deficit. Something also not generally reflected in the German discussion, because they see surpluses as a sign of success, almost like a sports league table, and which they lead, and that was an addition to their vulnerability, because a surplus means you're dependent on others. And that's where the string of good luck turned into a string of really bad luck.
So big picture, Germany now finds itself in an economic crisis. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't call it a crisis. I think it's a slump. It's a structural slump. It's not dramatic in the sense of that suddenly something happens, but it's a slow period of relative decline in respect of other people. You see it in
like letting
trains.
The air out of a tire.
Yes, that's what it is. You see it in trains, for example. Trains are late, overcrowded. We saw a change from a very, very good railway system to one that I think in many respects is now worse than what we have in the UK.
Wow, that is bad.
That's quite something. No? And France still maintained one of the world's best railway networks. This is a complete gap. France at least managed to invest in the public sector, and this is another thing that happened with Germany. The way they imposed austerity, which is one of the reasons why their account surplus is so large. The state also didn't generate deficits; it also generated surpluses. They did this by not investing. So they followed a fiscal rule by not investing. And you see this in the rail system. You see this in the motorways. Bridges have collapsed and been closed down. But you see it also in them not investing in digital infrastructure, and this is where the future comes in. This is why this thing has been so toxic.
If I'm a voter in Germany, in either the East, which has been particularly badly hit by some of these industrial problems, or frankly anywhere, I'm right to feel pretty angry with the kind of ruling elites, if you want to call them that, of previous decades, because by your account, they got a lot of kudos and a lot of people wrote nice books about them, but actually they didn't make very good decisions, and they've left Germany at this very difficult moment. So how much of the current political turmoil, including votes for the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht Party, etc., how much of that do you think should be put down to this economic set of problems?
Oh, that's almost entirely this economic set of problems. I would probably add that unification was essentially mismanaged, but again, that's to do with this problem. West Germany tried to force East Germany into its economic model rather than allowing East Germany to develop its own, was ultimately the failure, and it didn't work in West. It's now failing in West Germany. It always failed in East Germany, and the gap was never closed. The income gap was never closed.
But there's one thing we haven't yet talked about, which is immigration, because a lot of people watching will be thinking, why are they not mentioning that? I mean, when you read about the AFD's program, a lot of their energy, a lot of the popularity comes from the fact that they are against the levels of immigration. Do you also count that huge 2015 acceptance of 1 million plus refugees that Angela Merkel was at the forefront of? Do you count that as a mistake? Do you think immigration has just made things worse, or how does that rank, do you think?
I don't think it ranks as high, personally, because the reason it became so important was that immigration it was badly managed. Certainly Merkel's eagerness to let them in did not correspond to any decisions to allow to actually manage the inflows with the same sort of eagerness. Again, they had constraints, fiscal constraints, and they set aside some money, but it wasn't a particularly smartly managed process. But if you look at the votes for the far right, the votes come in industrial towns, dilapidated rural areas, and basically in areas that were left behind by the modern world, and where the change that happens through immigration became most visible. So these communities are less economically secure than they were before, and I would put this would have been a very different experience had Germany experienced 3 or 4% growth as it had done in previous years. People would, and if that growth had still been taken place in those communities.
Well, they are closer to it, I suppose, because if you're a wealthy person with a big house in a big town,
then
it doesn't really affect you. Whilst if you're having lots of newly arrived refugees moved into your poor neighbourhood, it massively affects your day-to-day life. I got to pick you up on one thing though, Wolfgang. I know we've talked about this before, but I'm 100% sure viewers will be raising an eyebrow. When you say far right,
yes,
and I know you use that phrase confidently throughout your book to describe the AFD, how do you defend that? Because to us, sitting here in the UK, where we have a party like Reform UK with Nigel Farage, which I definitely don't think is far right, it seems very similar to the AFD. They both have some strange characters in. There will be some people who have histories with unsavory parties and all sorts of things like that. But big picture, they are just part of the democratic process, aren't they? Are they really far right?
They are far right. This is not I'm not particularly emotive about them. I'm even advocating that the center right builds coalitions with them. So I'm against all the firewall, against all the stigmatization. I think they should be brought into government. So this is not so much a name calling or a thing. They are far right because they take an extreme position. This is not a Reform UK. I think we had this conversation a year ago.
I thought you might have moved on it somewhat.
No. I think they do have a tolerance. They're not Nazis, but they have a tolerance of Nazis, and they're one of their best known leaders in one of the states. He is a man who he's been convicted by courts for using Nazi slogans, which under German law is not allowed. These guys are not these guys are not your average right wingers. They talk about they're not talking about just cutting immigration. Some of these characters have been participating in discussions of what they call remigration with an R, where they actually take not only what Donald Trump is saying, getting immigrants out, but even immigrants that have acquired German citizenship. So you're looking at if it was a different immigration policy, I'd say that's fine. If you say illegal immigrants should leave, that's fine. They're not actually. This is not a problem that Germany is, unlike the United States, which has a problem with illegal immigrants. So you can change the policy, but to get people who are legally in Germany out is this is a breach. I mean, a lot of what they are proposing is a breach of the German constitution.
But are they really proposing forced repatriation of German citizens with foreign heritage?
No, the party does not do that as an official party, which is where the federal party has distanced itself from these characters. But the federal party also has not, these characters are still play an important part in the party. So it has not distanced itself. They have the means to exclude those characters. And it's very difficult for anybody to form coalitions with them in states where the party is as extreme as they are. They are not similarly extreme in all the states, and I believe they will eventually be brought in to government, because at the moment what happens is by keeping them out, the same centrist parties will always form the same coalitions. It's just a game of, if you think of 4 parties and 3 coalition partners, it's like a game of musical chairs with 3 chairs and 4 participants, and it will always be that if you keep, unless you include them. The same with the left. I personally always felt it was right for the center left, the SPD, to form coalitions with the Greens or the far left. And then say far left. No, it's not like, I'm not accusing them of being communist or anything, but they are significantly more to the left than the SPD, and the same on the right.
Okay, so let's consider that argument put aside for now. We can revisit it in a year when you come back to discuss what's happened since. We're now up to date, right? We have a Germany with a series of very difficult structural problems, a lot of people feeling less rich, less successful than they would like to be, than they used to be. You have a groundswell of support for what you call far right and other people will call, populist parties such as the AfD and the Sarah Wagenknecht party. What happens next? Because the government coalition has fallen apart. The general election has been called for the end of February. What's your prediction? I mean, could Germany see a populist wave, just like the United States has seen and so many other countries? Could we see a populist government in Germany after February?
Not in February, but I would expect this to be 4 years later. The way the system, the way it has worked now, the AfD is significantly stronger than it was at the last election. Last election, they were around 10%. They may get around 17 to 20%, so they will be stronger. There's this new party.
Does that make them the largest party potentially in February? You think?
No, the CDU will be larger. The CDU, the old Merkel's old party, the leaders Friedrich Merz, they're polling between 30 and 36%. So they are way in the lead. They can collapse. I mean, Merz is a character who has a tendency to say things spontaneously that he sometimes regrets. It could, last time, we remember the last election 4 years ago, the CDU had a candidate who collapsed. I mean, he was making jokes at a ceremony for flood victims, and people thought this was completely unacceptable.
But Friedrich Merz, who is in charge of that centre-right party, the CDU, he's actually been quite clever, hasn't he? Because he has learnt from the success of the AfD and he has sharpened his rhetoric about immigration and those kinds of topics. So tell us about that.
He's taken over their subjects. And, he's been very clever indeed. He's taken over their subjects on immigration, so he's certainly sharpened that position. But also he's signaling to the left that he's open to reform of the fiscal rules. That was actually a shock for the little FDP, because they thought they wanted to leave the coalition, or they left the coalition over the principle of allowing a fiscal expansion. Now the CDU, which it always considered its natural partners, is also turning on them on this point. Quite an interesting sort of subtext. But the CDU is sort of opening up, sort of already preparing for another coalition.
And that's with who then? That would be.
They have choices, basically 2 choices essentially.
But not with the AfD.
Not with the AfD.
Is that ruled out?
That's ruled out for this time. Yeah, the CDU has put a sort of a. This is more than just a read my lips thing. This is basically a party decision. This is like this is almost like a written down contract.
So this is an omerta, a complete ban on collaborating.
Absolutely,
with
for the entire party is that the case. They cannot form coalitions at any levels, local, state.
But you think that's a bad idea?
I think it's a bad idea.
Because it will just lead to fanning the flames
That's
and
right.
increase popularity for the
That's
AfD.
right.
I mean, it does seem pretty obvious, doesn't it?
It seems obvious.
Every other country
it seems
has
more
done the
obvious
same.
from abroad than from inside Germany. Very few people inside Germany would agree with me there, but it's something that the view inside Germany is that the party is so horrible that we must completely have nothing to do with them, and then therefore we just form the same kind of coalitions again and again. A lot of people, especially in the media, will support the idea of grand coalitions. They had 3 grand coalitions under Merkel. And it was those grand coalitions that did the deal with Russia, that did the dependency with China, that run the large current account surpluses, that failed to make the economy, put the economy on a broader base. Right. So that's where we come back with the story. It's the same kind of policies. So Merz, they're talking about an absolute majority. Now they are in the polls ahead of everybody else, but they're a long way away from an absolute majority. An absolute majority, depending on the country has a representation threshold. So an absolute majority doesn't mean 50%. Normally, if I'd say 44% is sort of a number that on current polling would give you an absolute majority. They're still some 10% away from this. Now, the little FDP, the party from Christian Lindner, would be sort of a natural coalition partner because they share sort of center-right, pro-business mindset. But we have to be careful when we say pro-business. Pro-business in Germany often means pro-large companies. This is not what I mean with pro-business. So the real debate is a different one. But certainly they have a certain common mindset. But together, even if the FDP manages to get through on the threshold, they're polling sort of close to the threshold, about 5%, and the fact that they left the coalition has increased their popularity somewhat because getting out of this unpopular coalition makes them look good because the others look so bad. But it's not clear that they will make it. But if they make it, even then there wouldn't be enough of a majority for the 2 parties. So Merz will actually have to form a coalition with either the Social Democrats on the left or the Greens. And that means the same policies again.
So your prediction then is pretty bleak because what you're forecasting is not a populist revolution, which some people might think would be an interesting and important development. What you're forecasting is basically more of the same, where you have a centre-right party that is talking the talk of the AfD, but will in reality have to be in coalition with a distinct group of parties that means more kind of sclerotic, lack of decision-making.
Absolutely. And in 29, I would expect, if this is indeed, like, say, the CDU forming a coalition with the Greens or with the SPD, I would expect none of the problems to be addressed because they will have the same fiscal constraints as the current coalition. They will have the same disputes, like the SPD wanting to secure higher social standards. And one of the things they just wanted to do, which they couldn't do, but which they almost surely would want to do in the coalition, is to ensure that any public sector bidding can only be accessible to companies that have trade union representation. So not every company is in that sort of trade union network. So they want to basically exclude any competition from the cartel, basically. So that kind of stuff.
This is why people on the political right get so exasperated with Europe generally, because it feels like the instinct is always for more regulation, making life more hard for businesses, more emphasis on trade unions. It's the kind of opposite of the Elon Musk, Javier Milei kind of desire to cut regulation and cut spending.
Well, you don't even have to go to Trump and Milei. You can also even cite Biden. Even the United States under the Democrats are not like that. Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a very significant industrial policy, a very successful, a rare case of a successful industrial policy program. And that's something the Europeans cannot simply not do because they're too bureaucratic and too blocking each other.
So if this just gets worse, as you are forecasting, what happens? The AfD then wins an absolute majority, potentially in 2029?
They would become the largest party. That would be my prediction. And then they have 2 choices.
Well, they can still be excluded, as the Austrian Freedom Party discovered.
That's right. And I think that's what's going to happen again. So the 3-party coalition, or the 2-party coalition that will now govern, will turn into a 4-party coalition. So that the only way for the center to govern then will be for everybody who is not AfD to form a coalition. like you have the centre left. Imagine in the UK, you had to form a coalition between the Tories, Labour and the Lib Dems. And you would also rely, because you didn't have a majority, you would also have to rely on some nationalists from Scotland or Wales. That would be the situation, because some other party
Not an impossible scenario
it can happen.
in this country.
Everything can happen, but I'm saying it's sort of so far it hasn't happened. And in the United States, you do not have grand coalitions between the Republicans and the Democrats. But that's the kind of thing that happened there, because under the days of Franz Josef Strauss, the sort of the Bavarian figurehead of the leader of the CSU, and he always said there can be no party to the right of us, because and they were conservative. They reached deep into the conservative spectrum, and they basically combined modernity with tradition. It was at that time when the sort of Munich, which is sort of the only city in Germany which sort of has some claim to be to live in the 21st century. They have modern industries. This is a sort of the island of Germany that is sort of connected to the modern digital world. There are venture capitalists in that area. There are companies that operate in AI and other areas. It's not like Germany has nothing. They do have a little. And that was the creation, this development of a conservative party that was able to stem this. Now, what happened under the long reign of Angela Merkel, the 16 years she was in government, she moved the party away from that tradition to the political center, opening up a huge gap for a party on the right, which the AfD has filled.
It sounds a little bit like, even though you're calling them far right, that you think an AfD insurgency, whether it happens in 1 year or 5 years' time, is what is needed, because it's the only thing that is going to kind of open up this increasingly fractured and decisionless government.
Be careful what you hope for, because the AfD, they are not Trump. They're really very, very different. When I say the traditional discourse in politics between left and the right, but they're both agreeing on the fact that Germany is an industrial country and can only be an industrial country. You talk to Sarah Wagenknecht on the left. She is she is sort of split from the left party and created.
She's anti-immigration, the Ukraine campaign,
anti-Ukraine
but pro-worker.
Pro-worker, but she's pro-old industrial model.
Yeah.
She wants to resurrect the old pipeline, so that the gas comes back from Russia. The AfD agrees with her on that. The AfD is also back industrial workers. They're not free. They're not freedom. They do not advocate entrepreneurial freedom. What Trump does, and this is where the German far right is different. That's why I call it a far right. This is not Trump. This is not a party. It's not Millet. This is a very different party. They're all, it's like Tolstoy's unhappy families. They're all different, and the far right, they are not.
So you're saying they're more a sort of left-right combination,
absolutely.
A bit maybe more like Marine Le Pen in that respect, a kind of big state populism.
We've had long history of right-wing extremism using socialism and so ideas from socialism. These ideas are not, as you go to the extremes. I mean, there are so many different strands, but this is not the liberal version of right. This is not libertarians. They are not people in favor of freedom of speech. You will not ever get any one of these guys.
Except when they are censored, I presume.
Except when they are censored, but they're not.
Many such cases.
So be careful what you wish for. But it's not. That's why this wouldn't help. If there was a sort of a takeover of the far right, this would destroy whatever in entrepreneurialism is left, because it would become very much a state capitalism. It would be, it wouldn't be even anti-trade unions, because that's not their agenda. So you may find that a lot of the things we talked about would be actually made worse. So the question is, where would this sort of, if you were saying, where could there be a libertarian revolution? And I don't think that can happen. So I think my scenario is very much, decline can happen. It's not, we always have to think there has to be a happy ending. It has to come up in some way. I can't exclude the fact that there is some political development that corrects this. And, there may come a time when Germans say, look, we need to change our economic model, and this doesn't work anymore.
Okay, I have an idea for you, Wolfgang, because it feels like at this final part of our conversation, we need to talk about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and what is happening, because we jumped ahead to February, where there'll be a German election, and we were speculating about what might happen. A month before that, in January, there'll be a new administration in charge of basically the free world, as they used to call it. That could have very seismic consequences for Germany, for Europe, for us over here in this hemisphere. And one of them, let me just throw this at you, might be that if they see Elon Musk taking a chainsaw to the size of the state and things don't break as much as people feared and the world carries on, there might be a lot of people in a lot of other countries thinking, ooh, maybe we should do that too. And if their economy surges and is successful in a Trump-Musk era, no doubt there'll be people in the UK, in Germany and across Europe thinking, maybe we need to try some of that medicine.
I would agree. I would agree that a successful Trump administration, successful as defined in Germany or in the UK, would change some people's minds. I'm absolutely sure about this. I mean, we see this, and I mean, people make these immediate judgments, like the appointment of Kennedy to the health secretary, that this would be an absolute disaster or foreseeable disaster. It may not. But if it's not, I'm asking the question: what would actually happen to our health industry if it is not a disaster, or what would happen if the Elon Musk does actually cut? Even if he just cuts only $1 trillion from the public sector, which is a more realistic number. But if he cuts $1 trillion, and we having, the EU having, the EU is so absurd. It has AI regulation without AI companies. It has crypto regulation. We don't have any crypto companies. We are regulating social media giants. We don't have any.
The EU likes to regulate to make sure those companies can't happen. Almost.
Absolutely. This is actually, if you're going back to the car industry, the big money in the car industry in the next 20 years is the self-driving car. Now, the battery problem will be solved. This is not going to be that's the big money now, and we need batteries, of course, but the big money will be in software. And we have the most restrictive AI regulation in the world. So the self-driving car will
be AI companies.
And no AI
Pretty
companies.
much.
So the self-driving car will not be invented by BMW and Volkswagen. It will be invented in China.
Or in Silicon Valley, where I've taken a self-driving car in Silicon Valley. They do exist.
They do exist. China's regulatory environment is freer than that in the United States. That may change now. But the EU is going to fall behind. So that's becoming an issue. It was interesting. When I sort of wrote the book, I could hardly find anybody agreeing with what I was writing about the need to deregulate, the need to actually free this up. Now I see voices on my Twitter feed of people saying, "Look, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm about to emigrate. I cannot do business in Germany," and I'm getting more and more also people from the venture capital industry. It's a small industry, but it does exist, saying, "Look, this can't continue. This is you're running into a disaster." So there is a beginning of something happening there, but it's not yet reflected in the political system.
But we're kind of almost talking ourselves into a position of hope here, Wolfgang, because you were feeling very much like decline was the most likely scenario. But let's just sit in this alternative scenario for a while longer, which is that an incoming Trump-Musk administration, I call it that because Musk is such a central figure, even though he's not the vice president, obviously. Trump-Vance-Musk administration, if that does even a third of the things they are saying they're going to do, and if it is not as much of a disaster as many people are predicting, it does feel like the voters of Europe will notice it. And there will be populist parties that will seek to copy them.
The German public and the media in particular have completely misjudged the entire Trump phenomenon. It was quite funny, the German media for the last week had a lot of article about what happened to his trial, because they had been writing about Trump is finished because he will be in jail. And they had to kind of explain to readers why he was actually the president, not in jail.
German media had been covering the Trump lawfare or lawsuits against him
I remember
if they were going to win.
Absolutely. And I also remember they did something similar during the Brexit referendum, where they covered the demonstrations. in great detail. So as though to suggest that because so many people turn out, like I don't know how many turned, there was a very large number of large demonstrations in London against Brexit, as though this was representative and that was sort of emphasized in the media. And then when Brexit happened, they were completely shocked. It was a poll before the...
Sounds like they need some new media startups in Germany as well.
I would assume, well, I've been involved in one, and I think there isn't enough, certainly there is not enough plurality of views. And the debate is mostly between an old left and an old right. And you know, again, don't compare the right in Germany with that of the United States. There are very few libertarians, and this is just about how do we save Volkswagen. This is not about, you know, I have yet to find out someone saying, why don't we open up to AI? We need nuclear power for that. We need a completely different industrial or a completely different regulatory environment for that. You don't hear that. You only hear about, bureaucracies because it's bad for farmers, it's bad for companies, but it's only for existing companies. It's not this, it's not an entrepreneurial drive that exists. And that's why I remain skeptical. Before the US elections, 80% of Germans thought Harris would win. People could think that, but it's just that 80% of them thought this. I mean, that it was a bit from the information.
So they're living in a completely different information environment.
They're living in a different information environment, and that's why I'm not entirely sure that a success of Trump in say Trump succeeded in not generating a crisis, and the stock market would rise, and the economy would do well. Say that were to happen, I'm not sure it would be registered as such, because people in Germany would generally not take this as a sign of success, but they think about social cohesion, workers' rights, and then they would say this is not happening in America, and they would probably report on the deportations, and they would, there would still be ways to see it differently. And because there won't be an objective judgment. You may think it's successful, someone else might think it's not, and so would Germany see this as successful? And the Millet. I mean, it was so funny to see Millet going to Berlin and shaking hands with Olaf Scholz. You could not think in the world at the moment two politicians who are more different in their sort of character, but also on their sort of political. They're both Western, and it's not like, but within sort of our sphere, to be so different from that. I don't think there is space in Germany for a Millet type character. Germany would probably need this. It would be good for Germany, but it has a constitution that the German constitution will basically prevent that you can rebuild nuclear power. It will take 15 years to build a power station because of provisions that are in the constitutions, in the legal system, that put obstacles to it. These are not just bureaucratic procedures that you can just legislate away.
I feel like we've spent some time in a more optimistic scenario in which the new American administration does well. Suddenly there's a desire to emulate in Europe and some kind of freeing up of regulation, and a new blissful golden era of entrepreneurship is born. You think it's unlikely, I guess I do too. Let's put that to one side. And unfortunately for our listeners and viewers, let's end with perhaps a more plausible, pessimistic scenario. Sketch out for us what happens if your first prediction is right, that more lack of good decisions continues, the economy continues to struggle further and further. America perhaps succeeds, perhaps doesn't, but China continues to grow. Europe is kind of squeezed and forgotten in the middle, can't find an economic solution that its voters are happy with. You will then get more and more unhappy voters, and they will be reaching for more and more, maybe increasingly implausible populist parties. What does that future look like? How bad could it get?
Germany is a rich country, a very, very rich country. So it can be irresponsible for a very, very long time. And this is, we always assume this has to end like next year. It doesn't have to end next year. It can continue for 10 years. And if it continues for 10 years, the rail system may have been fixed by then. They may have done something, and they may repair a few things. But they will not have. They will still have. They still have good companies, and they will not all decline. That some of these companies will do well. They may be lucky that somebody in the world needs what they do, and then suddenly they have a mini boom in this area. Macroeconomics can always produce a boom. There can always be low interest rates, can always create another housing boom, and that can create some economic activity. So economies don't decline in a straight line. They decline in cycles, but the average is low. The average is low. The expectations are lower. The income will be, income expectations will be lower. People will be more cautious. They will go on holiday less. We know what happens in economies like this. People exist. They still be driving cars and still go on holiday from time to time, not as often as they did before. So that can go on.
But what happens politically in that scenario?
Very fragmented. We will have a great fragmentation, as you described. You'll have the same governments people that will accuse each other, mostly blame gaming, because everybody points fingers rather than trying to solve the problem. And you will have continuously implausible populists. We haven't had a plausible populist yet. Trump was a plausible populist, and I think there's a difference between...
Well, he now looks plausible because he's been elected twice. A lot of people said he was implausible in 2016.
Exactly, but that's, he's been, he had and the 2016 economy was pretty good. I mean, this was not a U.S. You could, and he was not very well prepared. It was a very chaotic reign. He's a lot better prepared now. So this is going to be very different. I think for the Europeans, this will be very different experience than last time.
Let's end by coming even closer to home here in London and talking about the UK. This is where you live as well. Obviously, the UK Brexited and left the European Union. Saying what you're saying about Germany and about the European Union, do you now think that Brexit was a good idea?
The irony is that a lot of what went wrong in the EU went wrong after Britain left. What happened in the EU, there was always a balance between liberal countries and less liberal countries, the north and the south, to put it crudely, with Germany being on the north side and France being often on the southern sides, but the alliances were never that fixed. And the UK was a hugely important, balancing item in the EU. By leaving the EU became less liberal, and the liberal states, mostly of northern and northeastern Europe, became a minority. So the EU, modern EU, is very much, the dominant force is probably France in the modern EU, and that wasn't the case before. Germany is kind of retreating into its own, trying to.
So is that a yes or a no?
So that's the situation. Does it justify Brexit? You want to get me to say that it justifies Brexit? What I'm saying is that I have no strong
view, but I'm wondering.
I didn't have a strong view at the time either. I did not have British citizenship at the time, so I stayed outside. I basically observed this like a science experiment. I would think that today it would make no sense for the UK to rejoin the EU, given the state of the EU.
But can we go further than that and say, given the world as you've just described it, the UK's only hope, really, is to lean into its American relationship and try to ride that more entrepreneurial wave instead of trying to get back into the overly regulated union?
The way for the UK to prosper is to depart from EU regulation. I always said Brexit only makes sense if you actually decouple. It doesn't make sense otherwise. Otherwise, you might as well stayed in. So to decouple and to certainly not to follow up on the anti-digital jihad of the EU, the anti-tech legislation, and to carve out niches in this sort of tech area, which the UK is in a position to do. It has excellent universities. It has the City of London as a functioning capital market. So the UK can do this. It doesn't need the US for that. So I think it is a mistake to think of, let's have a free trade treaty with Trump. I don't think that's going to happen. Friedrich Merz also thinks he can get a free trade treaty with Donald Trump. I think we've been through this before. Trump's interest at the moment is a different one. He's not a free trader. We know that he wants to impose tariffs, and he doesn't want to impose tariffs because he wants to rebalance the trade balance. So he wants jobs. He wants industrial jobs back. It's a very basic thing. Even if he knows that it's probably bad for economic growth, he's not stupid, but he's not prioritizing economic growth. He's prioritizing much more concrete steps for his electorate, and these are jobs on the ground, jobs in certain areas in the United States that have been lost, and therefore that might just well succeed. On this narrow term, it may well succeed. A trade agreement with the UK or the Germany or the EU would actually not fit into this picture.
Well, just to slightly disagree with you, I think the other reason for the tariffs idea is to use international trade as a tool for hard diplomacy. And basically, he will say to people, yeah, you can get past our wall of tariffs if you agree with us on everything else we're doing, sign up to rejecting Chinese goods, do whatever else he wants us to do. So he may find that he picks off countries, and Germany and the UK might be on that list, to say, yeah, you can come past the tariffs, but you've got to be 100% ally. We're not interested in anything else.
And that's the problem for Germany. Germany cannot say yes to that, because I think that's what Friedrich Merz in Germany will find out. Germany is too interwoven into Chinese supply chains. I mean, German industry is still investing into China, whereas everybody, they're doing with China what they did with Russia. And you know, if the US were to do exactly what you're suggesting, which I think is a very realistic scenario, the US will demand that Germany complies with American China policies. It will demand that it decouples from China. That will be very, very difficult for Germany to do physically, because it will cause a significant chaos to the German company. This system that Germany created is absolutely reliant. It's not about just sales to China. It is lots of intermediate inputs come from chains in which China is central.
Those Volkswagen cars are not only sold back into China, but they are partially made with Chinese goods.
There are cars that they're actually made in China and re-imported to the EU. And now that the EU has imposed tariffs, actually one of the companies that is paying the tariffs is Volkswagen for importing China-made cars into the EU.
And then you throw in, just to really throw our brains into a headspin, you throw in the fact that Elon Musk is also a Chinese industrialist, in the sense that much of Tesla is reliant on China. So he himself can't decouple from China. So exactly how that plays out, I've got to say, it's above my pay grade.
A policy to decouple from China is not going to work. And I don't think it's going to happen. And I would also assume that Trump, what we know from Trump, I mean, what people say and how people act are often different. And the stated preference as opposed to the revealed preferences. Trump doesn't like wars. Trump doesn't like conflict. He does focus, he has his transactional things he wants, and he wants to achieve them. But he has so far shown no appetite of engaging in major wars. On the contrary, his goal is more to end wars. And I don't think he will end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, as he says, but I think he will make a serious attempt to end it. I think
Which might be popular in Germany.
Which might be popular in some parts in Germany, and people would then say, this is better. It is better to do that than... so it might change views, and where I agree with you is that the political environment is highly dynamic. So stuff could happen, new parties could emerge, new weights could shift. But it's like in any political system. France, we've seen Macron came up out of nowhere. So France was open to this new idea. Germany was open on the right and the left, but not in the center. That's going to be difficult to get a party in the center with a different political narrative. The system is highly protective of existing parties. And it doesn't allow, for example, on the funding side, it's difficult to get a party up and running in Germany in the political center that would actually compete with other parties. There have been some attempts locally, successful. There's a free voters, but they're mostly sectarian. They follow certain interests, but they're not the kind of big picture stuff that we talked about, like a complete shift in the economic model. I think we're still far away from that.
Wolfgang, we could go on all day. It's been absolutely fascinating. The next test of your predictive power, I must say you predicted the emergence of a Sarah Wagenknecht party the last time you were on this show, or maybe the time before, very accurately, and that did happen. Your prediction for February then is a win by the CDU, but they will have to be in coalition with some quite unhelpful people, and it will lead to not very much in terms of radical new directions for Germany.
That's right. It will be another coalition of the left.
Well, we will get you on to discuss it. Wolfgang, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Freddie.
That was Wolfgang Münchau, a bit of a friend of the show at this point. We've had him on a few times, and every time he comes on, he correctly predicts something new. There's no one whose views on Germany and the reality of Europe I would rate more highly. So that bit of a tour d'horizon of all of the issues facing Germany, what might happen next, that was absolutely fascinating. Thanks to him, and thanks to you for tuning in and staying with us this long. If you did, this was UnHerd.